Good morning and welcome to the fifth meeting in 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have three pieces of subordinate legislation to consider, and I intend to allow up to an hour for this part of the meeting. We will begin with an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance on the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, Co-Ownership Authorised Contractual Schemes Scotland Regulations 2026. The Minister is joined by Scottish Government officials, Laura Parker, LBTT Policy Lead, Director for Tax and Revenues, and Laura Wilkinson, Lawyer. I'd like to wish you good morning. It's an awful long time since we saw you, Minister. We were all starting to miss you. I'd like to see if you'd like to maybe have a wee opening statement.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. Delighted to be back. The Land and Building Transaction Tax, Co-Ownership Authorised Contractual Scheme Scotland Regulations 2026 provides for an exemption from LBTT for qualifying unit transactions within a Co-Ownership Authorised Contractual Scheme, or COACS. The proposed amendment recognises that the issuance, disposal or transfer of a unit within a COACS is a tax-neutral transaction for LBTT purposes. In other words, it does not represent a disposal or acquisition of land and property in Scotland. These proposed amendments aim to ensure that an LBTT liability does not arise to investor-level unit transactions where the underlying land and property within a COACS remains within the scheme itself. The proposed exemption aims to support investment in Scottish land and property by COACS by removing the tax and administrative burdens created by treating an investor-level unit transaction as a land transaction, despite there being no overall change in scheme ownership of the land or property. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this SSI with you today and look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much for that brief but helpful opening statement. I'm just wondering, you touched on the fact that this is, to, and I quote, ensure that transactions do not give rise to tax liability under the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, Scotland Act 2013. But why should there be no tax liability?
Well, effectively, the structure of these is where individual investors own part of an entity that then owns the property. So if the individual investors are moving in and out of that entity, then it's clearly not the purpose of the tax to be able to tax those transactions. It's about when the ownership of the property itself is transferred. The material impact of this, of course, is that those transactions effectively aren't taking place in Scotland, which means that investment isn't happening. There's a different structure with stamp duty down south, but the effect of that is the same as we are proposing here, which is that there's no tax liable on those transactions, and that obviously creates an environment where it's more advantageous to make those investments south of the border. So there is no tax lost at the moment with these transactions because effectively they aren't taking place.
So if this statutory instrument doesn't pass, it'll be a disincentive to invest in Scotland, is what you're saying?
It removes the disincentive to invest in Scotland.
This removes the disincentive? This removes the disincentive. Okay, so there will be one. Have you any idea what level of disincentive we will be talking about? We
don't know because obviously there's no transactions happening at the moment. SFC have said that it's below the materiality threshold, which is 5 million. So we won't know effectively until this is removed and those transactions start taking place.
Okay. So you're expecting a boost in investment then if this is implemented?
I'll be honest, I mean, officials may have more to say on this, but I don't expect it will be a huge boost, but it's an exercise that's required in order to give that level playing field.
Okay, thank you. John?
Thanks so much. I'm just wondering if there could be a loophole here for people to avoid tax. So, I mean, if the land was owned by A and B, and then they separately, A sells to C, B sells to D, so there's a complete change of ownership and no tax.
Well, COACS are regulated by FCA, so it's quite a strict process to be identified as such. I can understand what you're saying, but I think the processes are in place to prevent that happening, and that's effectively what happens down south. I don't know if officials want to comment on that.
Yeah, just to clarify that the initial acquisition of property into the fund is still subject to LBTT even when this exemption is in place. It's the transfer of existing units within the fund itself when the property has already been acquired. So there's still that initial LBTT charge on when a true when a true land transaction takes place. This is just an exemption for the unit level transfer.
So the fund is still there, but could be owned by completely different people, and there would be no tax. Is that right?
So the way these funds are set out, so you have the fund manager, the fund depository, who's an independent entity who manages the assets on behalf of the investors and the fund, and they also make sure that the fund manager is acting in the best interest of the investors despite their own commercial interests. And then you have the investor level transactions who come in and buy units in the fund. So there's multiple layers of sort of governance, oversight and regulation, and the FCA regulations in this space are very robust in terms of...
So if the convener and I set up a fund and bought some land, and then we both sold to Mr Harvey and Ms Smith, there'd be no tax because the fund would still be in place?
No. So if you sold the asset out with the fund, so if...
No, I'm saying that you'd selling the units in the fund, not the asset.
You'd
Yes.
have to get FCA approved, Mr Mason.
Okay. I'll not pursue this any further, but I had some
That was
reservations.
a good go, if I'm honest. We've got no other questions, Minister. Oh, sorry, Mr. Patrick's just coming.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I am still a wee bit unclear what the purpose of all of this is. I mean, I understand from the policy note what the policy of the government is, but I don't understand why it's the policy. Can you just explain in a slightly simple terms to somebody who frankly had never heard of these mechanisms before I looked at the papers for this meeting, what is the public value in exempting these particular transactions from a tax that others who are involved in land and building transactions pay? What does the public get out of this?
They would still pay that if they were transferring it out of the fund. So the fund is the entity that owns the property, if you like, as any other investment vehicle, company, individual can own property. When the fund sells the property, then the tax would be payable. What this does is that the structure of those funds is there'll be lots of different investors that own a part of that, and to them it's a financial investment transaction. So when they are selling the units within the fund, at that point, which is obviously further upstream, there's no tax payable, which is, as I say, the same process that applies down south, which is when this was introduced up. That wasn't covered off, so the effect of that means that people aren't investing in those funds in Scotland.
But it still sounds as though we're talking about dressing a property investment up as a financial investment. What's the purpose of it?
Well, the purpose of it would be to attract more investment into Scotland for property.
Well, you could do that by exempting lots of people from paying their taxes.
Well, it's to do with the structure of these funds. So the individual isn't buying the property, the individual is buying a unit share in a fund, and the fund is then buying the property.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the agenda item 2, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I'd like to invite the Minister to speak to and move S6M 20588.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. That the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Land and Building Transaction Tax Co-Ownership Authorised Contractual Scheme Scotland Regulations 2026 draft be approved. You would like to speak to the motion?
Nothing further to add, Convener.
Okay, and you've already moved it. Any members wish to speak at this point? No member has asked to speak. I therefore put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M 20588 be agreed. Are we all agreed? You can record your abstention indeed. So that's 5-4 and 1 abstention. Okay, so the motion is therefore agreed to. I'd like to thank the Minister, and we'll now move to the next item on our agenda, which is again from the Minister for Public Finance on the Scottish Aggregates Tax this time, the applicable rate of tax regulations 2026. Apologies, as I'd like to give you an opportunity to change officials. The Minister is joined by Cara Wood, Senior Policy Advisor, Aggregates and Landfill Taxes, and Laura Wilkinson, lawyer. Again, I welcome our witnesses and invite them in to make a short opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's intended introduction date for the Scottish Aggregates Tax is 1st of April 2026. When introduced, Revenue Scotland, Scotland's tax authority for devolved taxes, will be responsible for the collection and management of the Scottish Aggregates Tax. As part of ongoing work to commence the Aggregates Tax and Devolved Taxes Administration Scotland Act 2024, the Scottish Aggregates Tax Applicable Rate of Tax Regulations 2026 make provision that is required for the practical operation of the Scottish Aggregates Tax. This instrument will provide that from 1st April 2026, the applicable rate of tax is £2.16 per tonne of taxable aggregate. The Scottish Aggregates tax rate in 2026 will align with the UK Aggregates levy rate for the same year. This approach will ensure stability and certainty during the transfer of power. This decision was also influenced by the block grant adjustment process and has enabled agreement on a novel method for setting the Scottish Aggregates tax block grant adjustment baseline, reducing risk to the Scottish budget. I'm happy to take questions.
Very much. In 2016-17, the tax was £2 a tonne. It's now £2.16, so that's 8% more than it was a decade ago. But inflation has been 41.5% over that period. So clearly, proportionately, there's less tax being raised. And I noticed that the SFC forecasts that this tax will raise £42 million in 2026-27. Now, the committee, as you know, went out and actually visited a place in Pumferston where they actually recycle aggregates. And they said that the cost of actually moving aggregates is so expensive because you've got to pay for a lorry, fuel and driver that they don't even sell to Edinburgh, you know. So I don't understand why you're maintaining the same price as they are down south. If you were to put that up, for example, from £2.16 to £3.24, you generate another £21 million a year in revenue. And what people have said to us who are actually involved in recycling is that that would create a boost to invest more in recycling of aggregates.
A very fair point, Convener, and I think that's a very valid conversation for us to have next year. The point of keeping the tax at the same rate as the UK this year is to allow us to have data to calculate the block grant adjustment, because without that we wouldn't have a level baseline to be able to understand what the block grant adjustment should be as we transfer the tax from UK to Scottish management.
I mean, I do understand what you're saying, but we've had a couple of years actually to work this out. You know, I mean, it's a long time since this issue was before the committee, and it just seems to me a missed opportunity to both stimulate investment in recycling and indeed to generate additional taxation, given that, you know, there's no likelihood that someone is going to say, well, you know, because it's an extra, you know, £1 a tonne or whatever it is, I'm going to I'm going to ship the aggregate an extra 50 miles or whatever it is, with all the costs that would impose. So I'm just wondering why I understand what you said about block grant adjustment, but I just wonder why the government has been so timid on this, really.
As I say, that's not the issue, and I say it's a very perfectly valid conversation for us to have next year. But the issue this year is that if we had different rates of tax, then it would make it difficult to agree on what the block grant adjustment should be to enable the tax to be transferred in the first place on a
okay, I would have thought that at this time, a couple of years after we've been through all this at committee, that you would know the amount of aggregate being used in Scotland and the movements of it. But I'll let colleagues in. John, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I mean, I was interested in what the Convener was saying as well. Just looking at the impact assessments, firstly, the island communities. I think when we discussed the bill, there was the thought that it's more difficult for islands because they haven't got the same choice as to where they might get aggregates from. And it says no new impacts have been identified, but perhaps there were existing impacts that could be dealt with. Has there been any suggestion that we could look at different rates for the islands?
So I'll let officials talk to the specifics on that, but as I say, the policy intent this year and the intent of these of this measure is to set the tax at the same rate as the rest of the UK to give us that BGA baseline, and then I think absolutely there's scope next year to look at variation in the rate or other factors that could impact upon that. But I don't know if you want to say anything else on that.
So we engage with stakeholders on setting the tax rate, including We engaged with stakeholders, including aggregates industry bodies, recycling sector representatives, COSLA and tax professionals on setting the tax rate, as that was a key issue during the parliamentary scrutiny of the bill itself. And they supported an initial aligning of the Scottish aggregates tax with the UK aggregates levy to avoid complexity, added costs to business and issues of competitiveness. We did also ask them about a variation in rates within Scotland itself, and the view that they provided was in terms of comparison to some of the other taxes like landfill tax, a variation within Scotland could cause issues within Scotland in terms of like waste tourism, if you think about landfill tax. So people looking for different ways to kind of circumvent having to pay the tax, and if the rate's lower in one part of Scotland, we'll make sure our business is done in that area, and you know, find ways to get around having to pay more tax.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, I understand the logic this year that we should keep things kind of steady, but I think it is something worth looking at in the future. I mean, I think we did take evidence that, you know, moving aggregate around is actually very expensive, so it's unlikely that people would take them on a ferry or off a ferry to get either to the islands or from the islands. So I won't be here next year, but perhaps somebody in my place will ask that question. And the other point I had was that there seemed to be, in the impact assessments, there's two separate paragraphs on sustainable development. Now, one of them is just very brief. It says the instrument will have no impact on sustainable development. Fair enough. Okay. The other one is a bit longer and ends up saying will have no impact on sustainable development and no adverse effects on the environment. And I just wonder, kind of following on from the convener, and again, maybe more of a question for next year, but if there was a higher rate, it would have an impact on the environment, perhaps, because people would use more recycled and less new material.
I think, again, those are perfectly valid considerations for us to look at as we move into next year, and look at, when we're in that place where we've got the level BGA, to be able to then make decisions on how we adapt this policy for the Scottish context. So I think, and you'll be here in spirit, if not physically, Mr Mason, I've no doubt.
I'll make a note to watch it online. I'll watch it online next year, right? So thanks, convener.
Mr. Before by Patrick.
I'm not sure I'll be watching it online.
From the Bahamas.
Mr Mason and the convener, I understand the logic in the first year because of the complexity of the BGA adjustment. I get that. But if it's the case that those in the sector are making an argument for the reasons that the convener set out, where they might want an increase in years to come, is that not also a reason for looking at the different areas of Scotland to have these differences? Because the logic there is that if there are different elasticities of demand between England and Scotland, there's also different elasticities of demand within the different areas. Is that something that the government will be examining?
I think, yes, indeed, we'll look at this next year when we come to consider how we set this tax, as with other taxes, in the budget, and be able to take a perspective on the issues that you've raised. Absolutely.
Okay.
Patrick.
Thank you, convener. Just to follow on from the point that was made about the views of different organisations that the government will have engaged with, I just wonder if it would be helpful, in the interest of transparency, for policy notes such as this to give a very brief summary of the extent to which the government has been lobbied by vested interests on any of these issues, and whether, for example, there was a difference of view by people economically active in the industry as opposed to those seeking a policy objective like sustainable development.
So in terms of engagement, I think that would be a matter of public record. In terms of discussions, depending on the group, those minutes may have already been published or they are available, so I think we're very comfortable in sharing that.
I mean, a lot of that information would ultimately be publicly available, but take a lot of hunting down. Mm-hmm. Whereas a brief summary in the policy note would give a little bit more transparency to let the government say who's been pushing in one direction or another.
Absolutely, yeah, I understand.
Thank you.
Point taken.
Ms Woods talked about waste tourism. Where is the evidence for that? Because I mentioned earlier about a company we visited in Pumferson that that doesn't even think it's viable to sell a few miles away to Edinburgh. So given, as I mentioned before, the cost of loading a lorry with aggregate, putting fuel in that lorry, hiring a driver and the time taken to ship it from A to B, where is the elasticity here? So, you know, when does it become uncompetitive relative to south of the border? Because I just don't see how an extra £1 or £2, even a £5 a tonne, I wouldn't suggest a £5 a tonne because there's impacts on the customers in terms of they spending it on building and local authorities fixing roads, etc. So we have to look at the other side of the equation. But where does this elasticity? Where is this elasticity? Because I just don't see any argument whatsoever for that. And I know some aggregates are shipped by boat, but what work has the Scottish Government done to look at that so that next year, if we're going to go through this again, that the tax is fixed at the optimum, which will benefit both Scotland in terms of encouraging investment in renewables, but also doesn't impact too adversely on the client base and those who are extracting?
As I said earlier, the government's position is that this year we're setting it at the same rate as the rest of the UK, so we get that BGA baseline. The decisions on the tax next year will take into account all of the factors that the convener and other members have raised to do the assessment.
But you must know about the elasticity. You must know how much it costs to ship a tonne of aggregate 1 mile, for example.
We have done some work on that, and as
Do you know
I
how
say,
much that is?
From memory, no. But as I say, the policy decision this year is in relation to the BG baseline, and next year we will absolutely be considering all of the factors that the committee's raised, as you would expect, as we make decisions on the levels to set the aggregates tax at for the 27-28 budget.
Okay. If no one else has any further questions, we will turn to formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I'd like to invite the Minister to speak to and move S6M 20364 that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Scottish Aggregates Tax Applicable Rate of Tax Regulations 2026 draft be approved. Minister, to move and speak to the motion.
Moved.
Do any members wish to speak at this point? None do. I'd like to now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M 20364 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Agreed. We are all agreed. Thank you very much for that. Minister, we'll now have a wee break just so that you can change officials again. Stop. We now turn to agenda item 5 and we hear from the Minister on the Scottish Landfill Tax Administration Amendment Regulations 2026, SSI 2026/8. For this last session, the Minister is joined by Scottish Government officials Jonathan Waite, Aggregates Tax Bill Team Leader, and Laura Wilkinson, once again a lawyer. I welcome Jonathan to the meeting and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Landfill Tax Administration Amendment Regulations 2026 remove entitlement to tax credit for new qualifying contributions to the Scottish Landfill Communities Fund from 1st April 2026. From that point, the fund will enter a managed wind-down period of up to 24 months. The regulations include clear transitional projections, and all contributions made before 1st April 2026 will remain qualifying, will continue to tax credit and will be spent on community and environmental projects as intended. Throughout the wind-down period, Revenue Scotland and SEPA will continue to administer and regulate the scheme, ensuring continuity of oversight until the fund is formally closed. Members may wish to note that the decision to close the fund followed a public consultation in 2025 and extensive engagement with Revenue Scotland and SEPA. The regulations will ensure an orderly and responsible conclusion to the fund while fully meeting existing commitments. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that opening statement, Minister. Now, according to the Business and Regulatory Impact Assessment, Scottish landfill tax revenues have declined from 149 million in 2015-16 to 56 million in 24-25, and contributions to the Scottish Landfill Communities Fund have halved over the last decade, and estimated to amount to about 1.4 million. And so that's why, because of the associated costs of administering the fund in future years, will breach legally permitted limits. Just wonder if you can tell us what these legally permitted limits are.
I'm going to defer to officials on the legally permitted limits.
Yeah, so they're associated with the regulation costs for SEPA, who are the regulator of the fund, for the team they have in SEPA. And there is also administration costs for approved bodies who distribute the funds to community organisations. So there's two levels of administration in a sense.
Sorry, I'm not really sure how that answers my question.
Oh,
I mean,
sorry, yeah. So
I said, what are the legally permitted limits? You know, associated costs. So you've talked about them, but without actually saying what the costs are.
So
in
I don't
pounds,
have the figures
and
to hand,
pence.
so we can circulate them afterwards. But there is a.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because the fund is next year would be £1.4 million now. I think for a lot of community organisations, that's still a substantial sum of money. So it would be helpful to know how much it's being used to administer this fund, because the whole idea of this instrument is because it's becoming less viable. So it would give members an opportunity to assess what they feel, because I think this is very geographic, this fund. We know that. It's not everywhere in Scotland that can apply for it. So what that means clearly is that disproportionately it benefits certain communities more than others, and they might be somewhat aggrieved actually if this fund is closed and not replaced.
I don't want to quote a percentage, I don't have the exact percentage for SEPA, but for example, if you mentioned there 1.8 million, for example, if the SEPA regulation costs were capped at 10% of that, and SEPA have a fixed number of staff that have to do this fund, then you could get in a situation where the fund becomes really small. So say you've got, say, a £1 million fund, the SEPA percentage can only be 10% of that fund, then for £100,000, SEPA can't employ enough staff to still do the regulation. So that's where it becomes a... you run into...
It's more than £100,000 to administer £900,000.
But potentially, if you've got a number of staff in place that still need to do the regulation, if the projects are still across the country.
Because, I mean, some of the respondents we've had say that there's going to be less support for local infrastructure, environmental accessibility and community engagement projects. And the most frequently cited concern is that community-led initiatives will be lost, for example, in funding play areas, skate parks, youth clubs and educational programmes. And this will disproportionately affect communities already experiencing socio-economic disadvantage. So given that's the case, what will happen to the money that is not being allocated to these community organisations? You know, is this going to the general tax fund? And is the Scottish Government thinking of an alternative fund so that organisations that will be disadvantaged by the removal of this fund can still look to receive funding?
So in terms of the fund itself, I think it's important to recognise, and officials keep me right here, but the operators themselves obviously benefit from the tax advantage, and many of them are signalling that they wouldn't want to be taking part in the fund because, from their perspective, it doesn't add up commercially, even with the tax benefits that are in place. So the size of the fund would reduce more significantly, much more significantly than has already been indicated, with those operators not being part of it anymore. And obviously the fund would have to be wound up at some point because, as you've indicated, convener, the amount of revenue coming from landfill tax continues to reduce. And at this point, we've reached that tipping point where if the operators aren't supporting the fund anymore, it starts to get to the point of not being viable anymore.
So what would replace it, if you like, in terms of the support for community organisations that have traditionally benefited from this?
I think that would be considered more generally across the Scottish Government's funding for communities and community organisations.
Okay, and will there be a gap? Because I think what folk would be concerned about is if this fund ended and then there was nothing else to replace it for a year or two, which could mean that projects that local community organisations may have been working on for months, if not years, don't then proceed.
Well, the fund will meet out its commitments, and this is a ramp down period of up to 24 months. So that will continue as the fund is wound up.
But the government does intend to have a replacement fund. Would I be right in saying that? Or
I've not committed
been
to
no
that.
discussion on that. So is that something the government would be willing to take away from this meeting?
Yes, to consider. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Liz?
Just on that point, I think it would be helpful if the government did consider that, because it strikes me that with the closure of the fund, that's being done largely for economic reasons, whereas those who are expressing their concerns to the committee are ones who are looking at the sort of social impact, particularly, as the convener said, if there are projects related to youth engagement in a local community, etc., that these have a very important impact, particularly if it's in a disadvantaged area, to try to stimulate community engagement. And that's potentially quite a problem. So I think it would be very helpful if the government did consider a replacement to ensure that the infrastructure provision is not lost altogether.
Point taken, yeah.
Patrick?
Thank you. I mean, I wonder if it goes a little bit deeper than just a replacement fund. I mean, this is really a problem that arises from the purpose of environmental taxes. If you levy an environmental tax for the purpose of changing behaviour or reducing environmental harm, it's not something that you should rely on as a future ongoing source of revenue, because if it's successful at achieving the environmental objective, the revenue will inevitably go down and ideally disappear completely because you've eradicated the environmental harm. So shouldn't there be a principle in the Scottish Government's overall tax strategy that says where we're using environmental taxes to achieve an environmental objective, and we're getting some benefit for the time being from the revenue, that there's a plan in place to shift the tax base to other forms of environmental harm as that revenue declines? Or at least that should be the presumption should be that that's explored as the projected reduction in revenue is anticipated. You look at shifting the tax base to other forms of environmental harm in order to achieve more environmental good, but also sustain revenues.
Well, I think there already is. So if you look at, for example, the projections, be the MTFS or whatever, the projections in terms of the income from this tax will have been projected to reduce over a number of years, and that will have been factored into the longer term calculations in terms of tax and spend, and that is clearly compensated by in the round by decisions we take in other taxes. So I think it's absolutely the case. Of course, everyone knew this was a situation. Those numbers would have been planned in over the medium term, and other tax policy would have been decisions taken, fully cognizant of the fact that this would happen. And then on the other side of it, in terms of the community benefit, clearly again the benefit from that fund would have been known to have been not something that would continue on forever. Everybody had been well aware of the time-limited nature of that. And if the question then was, do you want to take the community benefit for that period of time, or do you want to take no community benefit? The answer clearly is you would take the community benefit for that period of time.
So you're saying the government has already considered alternative forms of environmental harm to shift the tax base onto them to ensure that there's a sustained revenue in the future? What are those other alternatives that have been under consideration?
No, what I said was that it was considered as tax policy in the round. So when we do the calculation for what tax revenue looks like in future, then the fact that this tax would be tapering down would obviously be factored into those numbers and those projections.
My suggestion was that the government tax strategy should have a specific look at environmental taxes, which are by definition not intended to be permanent sources of revenue, and look at shifting the tax base from one form of environmental harm to another in order to maximise the benefit and maximise the revenue.
I hear what you're saying, but as I say, tax policy is considered in the round in terms of total revenue versus total spend, and we don't have a separate line per se just for environmental taxes. Each of those will be considered based on the behavioural change we're trying to drive and the impact that would have in terms of revenue and the longevity of that, rather than starting with a number and then basing the policy on the number. We start with the policy and work it that way around.
Okay. I think there are lots of forms of environmental harm out there you could think of taxing.
Yeah, I would say actually if you put aggregates tax up by £1 a tonne, you know, you'll have £20 million to come in. That will certainly more than cover any loss. So when you get round to actually change that, hopefully next year, some of that money will be able to go to some of these communities. Just before I let John in, I mean, I would just give a wee advert for Revenue Scotland. I'm sponsoring an exhibition for them this week in the bottom of the members' block, and they have a policy of 1% of the revenue brought in is effectively spent on administration, including the building safety levy bill, which is, I would have thought, a lot more complex than this. So maybe there should be some thought given to perhaps transferring responsibility of this fund to them, with maybe SEPA providing some kind of oversight on that. Maybe that would save a few bob. Anyway, John.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, it was just as others were speaking, thought came to my mind that, I mean, presumably the idea of this fund was to in some way kind of compensate communities adjacent to a landfill site for the upset, smell, etc. that they have suffered, one of which is in my area, as the Minister probably knows. And it strikes me that, I mean, I take Patrick Harvey's point that it was always going to be time limited, so these are in many ways a one-off grants. But it's the timing of it doesn't quite match, because the funding is going to stop this April, or at least the money going into the fund is going to stop this April, but that landfill site is still operating, and even if it closes, which is what the community wants, there will still be gas given off over a number of years in the future. So the kind of suffering, if you like, of the local community will continue even though the landfill stops. And I'm not asking for a commitment right now, but if that could just be a factor that the government would consider if it's thinking about transitional relief or something like that. Thank you.
Yes, point made.
Just a question, I thought I touched on it earlier on, but I don't remember getting a response. See this, the money that's not going to these community organisations, will it just go into the Scottish Consolidated Fund?
The money that's going into...
If you're not giving it out to community organisations, what will happen to it, even if it's $1 million or 1.4 million a year, whatever it happens to be, will it just go into the general...
So just to be clear, so the money that's, officials keep it right on this, but the money that's in the fund or coming into the fund would be spent through the fund. There would be no more money coming into the fund because there's a tax benefit that goes to the companies to incentivise them to put money into the fund, and with them opting out to a large extent of the contributions through that mechanism, then that money isn't coming back into the fund.
Right, so it's not going to taxpayer. It's just been kept with these companies at the moment.
Yeah, so the taxpayers have an option to contribute to the fund. So if they didn't contribute to the fund, they would just pay 100% of their landfill tax liability. So at the moment, a number contribute. So if they choose not to, all the money would just come to Revenue Scotland and the Scottish Consolidated Fund, and not go into the separate communities fund.
Okay. Thank you for clarification on that.
Tax credit benefit on that is 90%, is that right?
Yeah.
Up to 5.6% of liability.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like now to move on. Do members have any comments on the Scottish Landfill Tax Administration Amendment Regulation 2026 SSI 2026/8? No member is recommending annulment. And members are therefore content for the committee to note the instrument, that is to make no recommendation on it. Members are. Although the committee is not required to report on a negative instrument, it could do so if it wishes to draw attention to any issues that have been discussed. So we'll no doubt discuss that in a private session. That is the last item on the public agenda, so I now move the meeting into private. I'll just have a 5-minute break to allow the Minister, his officials, broadcasting and the official report to leave. Thank you, Minister. No doubt. Thank you.